Well, good morning and thank you for watching this May 27th Tuesday weather update. I'm Matt Reardon. On Friday, Eric explained to you all how the atmosphere breathes and the momentum conversation that we watch every single day to figure out where the forecast is going, where we're seeing momentum come out of the West Pacific and affect the jet stream in different ways. And I think this morning's a great segue on top of that kind of inhale and exhale of the atmosphere, if you will. We are seeing one of those rushes or those exhales of momentum coming out of the West Pacific. If we just look at the Pacific jet stream this morning, I mean, in late May, this isn't all too common that it is very clear where the jet stream is across the Pacific. That is starting here in Japan, and then we can actually draw this jet stream line all the way through British Columbia, all the way over to North America from Asia. So an obvious Pacific jet extension here this morning, this increase of momentum. We've seen this lack of it, starting in March, really kind of near the end of March, persist through April, cut off lows. We've talked about ridges, areas that have received far too much precipitation and areas that have received too little. Now, we've been able to graph this in different ways. You saw a number of them on Friday and Thursday from Eric and myself. If we look at these things called Havmuller diagrams, where we're getting a sense for where air is rising in the atmosphere, well, over the last 30 days, specifically looking at the West Pacific, which is often an area of focus for that rising motion, storms, convection as a source for momentum to increase that jet stream across the Pacific, it was relatively lacking at times, going back to early May, and then if this graph stretched further into April. But over the last 7 days, if you will, as we go further to the left on this color bar, this is our proxy for rising air in the atmosphere. And we've seen that increase over this sort of 14 to 20 day stretch. Now, this is a forecast, so this black line is the present day in the GFS forecast. As we go down, we actually get all the way out into June. We can see that momentum continues at least, roughly for the next 7 to 10 days. Now, a number of questions as we get out here to the middle part of that June forecast. Is the momentum, at least looking at this GFS forecast, going to back off? Because that's going to raise some of our concern for those ridges that we're concerned about in summer. But at least right now, this is, I think, an important pattern change. We'll have to talk about the results and the influences of that. A different way we can kind of graph that momentum conversation, again, going all the way back to February, is just looking at the Earth relative anomaly of that momentum. Now, in February, we hit this peak. You saw this on a different map from Eric on Friday, but you can see that peak, and then the trend since then, at least through mid-May, has pretty clearly been a downward trend in momentum. It's only in the last sort of 7 to 10 days that we've started to reverse that trend, and that appears to continue, at least looking at that GFS forecast that we just saw from the West Pacific. Now, what did this downward trend mean? It meant, frankly, for a number of areas across the southern U.S., cut off lows, these lows that just kind of meandered. In fact, we're seeing another one here today, bringing showers and storms across a wide area. But parts of Alabama, parts over towards South Carolina, even parts of New England, just in May, that is May 1st through May 26th, this area has been much wetter than average. In fact, some of these areas on trend to hit their wettest May on average. We'll see what the end of this week holds. But then other areas across the Midwest, we've talked about a lack of soil moisture. So we've brought up the soil estimates from NASA, just looking at soil moisture deficits, and they continue to linger right repeatedly across parts of Iowa, Illinois, even into the upper Midwest at times as well. So those areas will have to be watched going forward as well. Now, the forecast, I think, is changing for some of these, especially given that momentum conversation and where that's going. If we look at the 500 millibar, this is just geopotential height anomalies for May. So this takes us from May 1st through May 24th. We've seen this ridge that's been parked across the Hudson Bay, and then these cutoff lows, right? This troughiness, if you will, stuck beneath that, which has brought a tremendous amount of severe thunderstorms here to portions of the southern plains at times, but also just rain, a lot of rainfall for parts of the southeast. We jump this conversation over here toward this morning. This is the 500 millibar winds. Again, just giving you an understanding of how we've gone from this to this. Well, we still kind of see a reflection, if you will, of that lower momentum pattern, and that there's this ridge kind of parked across Canada and these cutoff lows beneath it. But what you can see here on the horizon is that this is going to change quickly in a big way as this Pacific jet extension starts to make its presence felt across the continental U.S. In fact, what we can already see here with this trough developing in the Gulf of Alaska is a more broad ridge starting to push in now to California. And that's going to be kind of one of the bigger stories this week, of the heat building into the western U.S. And when we get hot here, I can tell you we tend to get colder here more often than not. There's that kind of yin-yang to the atmosphere. We got other stories here this morning. We can see lingering showers across portions of Iowa and the Midwest. Some of these here in Illinois aren't making it quite to the ground. We're seeing some drizzle and droplets out of this. We saw severe storms push through Texas yesterday, other parts of the southeast, some wind events across portions of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and then some lingering showers across the southeast. We'll take a look at this extended forecast just a second, get an understanding of where we're headed with some of the precipitation, the storms, and the severe weather here. Did want to mention before we get much further into this is that hurricane conversation that we had near the end of last week. There was some question. The GFS had a stronger, more obvious storm developing where the ECMWF kept it weaker. At least right now, that kind of early GFS forecast not doing a bad job, with the National Hurricane Center now predicting a 90% chance of tropical storm formation or above. That's over the next 48 hours. We're going to watch this potentially quickly develop here over the next 2 days. If we jump over and just look at the infrared satellite imagery of the eastern Pacific, here's Mexico on the top right of the screen. You can see those thunderstorms developing in southern Texas overnight, some of these severe storms. But the focus for the National Hurricane Center is this broad spin here, southeast of Mexico in the eastern Pacific Ocean. You can kind of see these thunderstorms here bubbling. If you look closely at some of the lower clouds here, that sort of broad spin, which says to me that it's a little bit broad, so we're not expecting, I would say, imminent development here this morning, but this will tighten over the next 48 hours and potentially form a tropical storm. Now, these typically don't impact the United States coming out of the East Pacific, especially early in the year like this, but it could impact the jet stream as it comes into the continental U.S., and that could impact our forecast, and we'll take a look at the results of that. Catch us up, let's look at unfiltered reports of yesterday. This is the Storm Prediction Center for May 26th. You can see a number of large hail reports. We've seen some huge hail here, in some cases exceeding 4 inches, maybe up toward 5 inches, and some anomalous reports there. So impressive hail across parts of Texas here this spring that continued over the last few days, and those wind reports across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama overnight with the severe thunderstorm complex you saw just kind of pushing off the coast in the last few frames of the radar image. I'm going to jump over. Let's catch us up on the ECMWF. This is the 500 millibar height anomalies. I'm going to let's make it valid as a 7 a.m. And you can really see how potent that trough is south of Alaska, west of British Columbia. We call this the Gulf of Alaska. And you're going to see this trough dig in here and help to strengthen the ridge to the west over the western U.S. And we're going to start to lose the influence of this Canadian ridge here. So this kind of lower momentum pattern that's still sort of halfway in our hair here this morning on Tuesday is going to start to break down. So as I take this forecast into Tuesday and now Wednesday, we see 2 things. One, this ridge developing quickly here over the western U.S. This ridge over Canada start to push off to the east. So take the forecast into Thursday. Continue to see this ridge develop over the western U.S. You can see it's kind of broken into 2 pieces now, and troughing now settling in across the eastern U.S. and eastern Canada. Do have this little cutoff flow here. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute here, but we continue to see this western U.S. ridge dominate here across Idaho, Oregon, California, bringing in potentially significant heat here to California. Heat watches are active, so extreme heat watches for California for the end of this week. Potentially could turn into extreme heat warnings. This is Saturday, May 31st. Now Sunday, June 1st, you see that ridge move across the continental divide here into the central U.S., and quickly that trough here across the Northeast Pacific, that is the Gulf of Alaska, has been replaced with a large ridge. So quickly we've developed a ridge in the west, and now we broke it down. We've replaced it with a trough by Monday. We've moved to that ridge. We were talking about the extreme heat potentially near the end of this week. By Monday, it's in the central U.S., and we see a pretty impressive trough wave pattern here. So a trough over the western U.S., ridge over the central U.S., trough over the eastern U.S., ridge flanking those respectively. That's that better momentum that we have in the atmosphere. I think it's best encapsulated there. So instead of what we were looking at in May with just these kind of meandering cutoff lows, a ridge kind of parked across one area, bringing dryness to the Midwest, we have a varied progressive pattern again with multiple probably weather events to talk about, potentially some severe weather precipitation, but not this sort of lull in the atmosphere we're going to park into one scheme. We saw it quickly replace some of these troughs and ridges in just a few days in the forecast. Now, in terms of what it means for the immediate forecast here, lingering showers and storms here over the southeast, that will continue today. Take this forecast into Tuesday. We talked last week about this kind of U-shaped in the continental U.S. precipitation pattern east of the elevation here in the eastern 2/3 of the country, with more precipitation kind of in a pattern like that. We'll see some of that continue here along some of the high plains here, stretching through the south and into the southeast here. This is tomorrow on Wednesday. So take this into Thursday afternoon. Again, more activity here across the sort of eastern quarter of the country. And as that troughing still settles in here over the eastern U.S., seeing that continue here on Friday. And then only at times lingering showers across the Midwest, perhaps on the weaker side, not bringing significant precipitation there. We see by Saturday, more proper low pressure system forms. We saw around a lot of rain over the weekend, portions of New England. That looks to continue here next weekend. A little bit of a lull here on Sunday into Monday, but at this point we're undergoing that pattern change that we talked about. So that ridge that was parked across the western U.S., now we're seeing that be replaced by a trough. We're seeing precipitation pick back up on Monday across parts of the Four Corners region and into the Continental Divide, the U.S. Rockies. Potentially next week, this is now Tuesday, June 3rd. The specifics of this were a little bit too far out now, past 7 days, to talk about any one area specifically. But with those troughs now moving through, with the ridges coming up and over the Continental Divide, then being replaced by troughs, we're seeing the potential for better precipitation across the Midwest and the Northern Plains getting out into next week. We're looking at Tuesday now on the 3rd. We see that push through on the 4th, potentially another system following behind that. Again, too early to say next week on Thursday who's getting rainfall and who's not, but definitely the better potential for some lead cyclones and troughs to move off into the upper Midwest, portions of the Northern Plains. We'll see how far south some of these severe storms get into the Central Plains and perhaps the Central or Eastern Corn Belt. If we look at the ECMWF forecast just for the jet stream level winds, we'll take that forward here this morning on Tuesday. We're seeing that troughing lingering here across the eastern U.S., ridging continuing to develop here across the western U.S., bringing the heat up at the end of the week. But then as we go through Sunday into Monday, we see that ridge now spreading out over the central U.S., troughing behind it over the western U.S., where we just briefly had ridging and the heat to talk about. On Tuesday, we see pieces of this getting now out in front of the Continental Divide, bringing precipitation and storm chances to the middle part of the country, the Northern Plains, and Canada as well. I'm going to take this forecast back for a second because that potential hurricane, it's very subtle here because we're looking at the upper level winds, but the ECMWF does develop it here off the west coast of Mexico. And what's neat here is these hurricanes exhaust quite a bit of heat into the upper atmosphere. And you can think of that almost like as this kind of in tandem ridge that follows along with these hurricanes. And what you're going to see here as I play this forward is this cutoff low here south of California actually kind of gets bumped out of the way by that ridge. So I'm going to play this quickly here. So go forward. Do you see it kind of get nudged out of the way as that ridge associated with that hurricane made its presence felt over Mexico here? And that little bump kind of keeps it over here and it allows it to get caught on this trough here. This is all the way out Sunday, June 1st. And then that comes all the way through Colorado on Tuesday, potentially impacting the precipitation that we're seeing here over portions of the Dakotas and Nebraska early next week. So these hurricanes do matter and potentially bringing up some moisture as well as they come through. Some of that can get across some of the higher elevations here in northern Mexico. Now, in terms of that precipitation and moisture, I'm going to take this forecast out into Wednesday tomorrow. See that activity continuing across portions of the southern plains and the southeast. Take this into Thursday and Friday quickly. I'm trying to get it out to that 7-day forecast. Now we're getting into Saturday, Sunday, June 1st. Now we're all the way out to Monday at 7 a.m. So there's our 7-day forecast. And again, that U shape to our precipitation still showing up here. Additional rains here coming for the southeast, portions of the mid-Atlantic, New England, portions of the central and southern plains. But in the Midwest and the northern plains, at least until we see those troughs start to get off the elevation here, continuing that dry pattern that we've been talking about over the next 7 days. Some of these areas, all the way towards zero precipitation forecasted. Storm Prediction Center, their outlook here for today. Again, we're going to expect areas kind of, again, on that line here from the Storm Prediction Center. So all the way down near the Rio Grande in Texas, through portions of the southeast. If we go into day 2, pushing up against the high plains here, additional storm activity out beyond that, although not expected to exceed severe threshold in a meaningful way, at least tomorrow on Wednesday, and then potentially on Thursday, additional activity in a very similar area, albeit, again, not to a high degree here. If we jump over and look at the AIFS, for just kind of a different opinion on the forecast here, let's make this forecast valid. Let's do Tuesday, 7 a.m. Wednesday. As I play this forecast forward, we see that strong ridge develop across the western U.S., seeing that troughing lingering across the eastern U.S. There's that hurricane bump, if you will, to that cutoff low. And then we're waiting for this trough to settle in across the western U.S. by Sunday. By Monday, we see it developing here, a piece of that cutoff low getting out into the central plains. And as that trough lingers here, potentially more systems coming out of the western U.S. into the central U.S. as we go through the work week next week. As a result of this pattern change, if we look at the 7-day forecast for precipitation, but the anomalies from the ECMWF ensemble, again, we talked about that area lingering dryness here over the Midwest, wetter in portions of the South, the Southeast, the Eastern U.S., the Southern Plains at times. As I take this to a 10-day forecast, now we start to see this area light up here, the Northern Plains, portions of the Central Plains, even getting over into the Four Corners, portions of the Southwest. If we look at the 8 to 14-day precipitation anomalies, we can see those really ramping up now across portions of the Central Plains, the Upper Midwest, Northern Plains, over toward the Rockies. I am watching some areas here that are part of this current dry trend that have missed out on some of this May and April precipitation as well, potentially looking at this precipitation activity staying toward the north areas, portions of northern Indiana or northern Illinois, kind of right on that line of that activity. So these are some areas I'll be watching closely with this pattern as it comes through early next week. Look at the AIFS forecast over that same time period. Again, the 7-day forecast can see that extended dry stretch here over portions of the central United States. If I take it to a 4 to 10-day, we don't quite see that activity picking up here off the Colorado Rockies. But if I take it out to the 8 to 14-day sub-select, you can see it really lighting up here. But again, some areas in here, right, looking out portions of Iowa, even northern Illinois, northern Indiana, portions of southern Michigan, some areas in here we're still lingering in those year-to-date precipitation deficits, even just kind of over the last 60 days. So seeing who gets missed and who gets this rainfall here over the next kind of 14 days will be important. But regardless, activity returning to the upper Midwest, the northern plains, portions of the Rockies here, maybe even California at times. We jump back to the total precipitation that I had up here earlier, see if I can find that. As we go through that forecast, with the heat expected at the end of this week, not a lot of precipitation out west expected. But if you take the forecast to Sunday, Monday, now Tuesday of next week, this troughing moving across the west could even see some precipitation in June getting into California, time that we're typically expected to staying dry in that portion of the country. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center for the 6 to 10-day outlook, we'll just go ahead and pull that one up here. Warmth increasing early next work week across portions of the upper Midwest, that troughing lingering across kind of the south and the east here, keeping those temperatures down. Florida temperatures rebound as well. If I jump back and show you the precipitation, you can see with that troughing pushing into the western U.S. at the end of this weekend, right, seeing precipitation pick up here. We talked about the potential for California included in that lingering dryness over portions of the Midwest extending into the east here. But as I take this forecast further out, right, 8 to 14 days from the Climate Prediction Center, we see that precipitation start to get into the northern plains, the upper Midwest. We'll have to see again which areas here miss out on some of this, but activity returning to this area with this pattern change. And regardless, with this more momentum, you noticed how quickly we went from a ridge in the Northeast Pacific to a trough, how quickly we went from a heat wave and a ridge potential in California to a trough. It's a pattern that's going to bring systems through. So it's going to be harder to find these areas of a lack of precipitation or too much precipitation as we go through this first half of June. The question becomes near the kind of middle part, June 10th plus, to see if this momentum starts to decrease in the West Pacific, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that going forward. I want to jump over and show temperature forecasts really quick so we can see some of those extreme heat values potentially in California, talk about some of the temperature trends elsewhere. I'm taking the forecast out to this evening here, 7 p.m. Tuesday. See those cooler temperatures lingering across kind of the eastern two-thirds of the country. But if you look over California, temperatures increasing to the 90s here. If I take it to May 28th, this would be tomorrow on Wednesday. Still cooler here across the eastern U.S., but temperatures slowly increasing across the western U.S. By Thursday, getting up into the mid-90s here in portions of California, cooler east. But really by Friday, seeing temperatures get up well into the triple digits, potentially in portions of the Central Valley, and portions of the Southwest as well. So this is where we're seeing those extreme heat watches for later this week, Friday and Saturday. Take the forecast into Saturday evening, again, getting up over 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of these areas, Redding, down toward Fresno, toward Bakersfield, up above triple digits here in Sacramento as well. And warming up as well in portions of the central U.S. So where we were kind of stuck in the 70s here for portions of this work week, starting to climb out of that. As we get to this weekend, we can see back into the 80s and 90s, even portions of the plains here. As we go out towards Sunday, with that ridge spreading across the central U.S., 80s returning to portions of the Midwest now early next week. Maybe even 90 here in western Illinois. This would be Tuesday of next week as that ridge comes through. But you'll notice how quickly, just over a few days, that ridge is quickly moving through, right? This pattern continues to oscillate with that excess momentum coming out of the Pacific. I did want to remark on one thing. Seeing reports here now, I've seen this quite a bit over the weekend of what's called unhealthy looking early crops this year. And these are easy to kind of correct, I think, in June with a temperature and pattern change. And I think what we're seeing here across portions of these reports coming out of South Dakota, portions of southwest Minnesota, some from Iowa, even a few comments from Illinois. Just picking on Mankato, Minnesota here, we're looking at year-to-date temperatures as they depart from average. So you can see here, looking back in time, going all the way to January 1st, where we've been warmer than average for some weeks and then gone colder than average. And this is a pretty typical, looking roller coaster for an area like this in any given year. But just over the last kind of 2 weeks, let's call it the last kind of 10 to 14 days, we've seen this swing from, warmer, drier planting conditions, maybe in early May and late April, just kind of this extended cool stretch across portions of the upper Midwest. And I think this is partially what we're seeing with some of those more unhealthy looking crop stands. So with some of the heat expected, right, we just talked about the warmth, the 80s and 90s getting back up into the upper Midwest. You can see Minnesota here, Mankato, potentially getting up into the mid-80s here next week. This would be Monday and Tuesday, potentially seeing some of a correction in that, some more GDD units getting on some of these early crop stands here in the middle part of the country. If we look out to the extended forecast, this is from June 5th to July 5th, and seeing how maybe the ECMWF is handling some of this renewed momentum. And we've seen this increase in precipitation here across portions of the Canadian Prairie, the Northern Plains, the upper Midwest as well. But we are still watching here, at least in this ECMWF forecast, some of these lingering areas where we're concerned about those soil moisture deficits are going to be important to watch as we go through early June. Do we capitalize on some of this early moisture this summer, keeping some of these areas wet, and stave off kind of that drought conversation till later in the year? That's what I'll be focused on as we get into the forecast next week. Made it to the end of the video here today. Thanks for watching, and Eric will talk with you all on Wednesday.